Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, Nelson Mandela once said, "I dream of an Africa that is at peace with itself." Now, half a century after many of Africa's colonies became independent, peace does remain an elusive goal across much of the world's second biggest continent. But democracy is on the march. More and more countries are seeking peaceful transfers of power at the ballot box. And yet against that backdrop, we still have terrorism, piracy, famine, tribal warfare, very much a looming threat across broad swaths of the African continent. Now, my guest today, William Fitzgerald, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
You are the U.S., let me get the title right, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs.
That's correct.
Now, it's a long title, but just so our viewers understand, you basically, to really boil it down, you've been on the front lines of American diplomacy in Africa at a time where I think most of us could agree, great change, but also great challenge.
Right, I think that's very true. I've been covering and involved and living on the continent for the better part of 20 years.
So it's fair to say you know Africa well. I'd like to begin with one of its toughest issues right now, Libya. It's free of Gaddafi.
Right.
He's gone. But it's no secret that the weapons are spilling over borders. There are fears, at least, that it will spill over borders into the hands of groups that are based in some very poor, very fragile countries, notably countries Niger, Chad, Mali. This must pose an enormous challenge for U.S. diplomacy. Hillary Clinton was recently there, and she spoke to this issue.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The flow of arms is very, very much of a concern, not only for Washington, but within the region itself. You have Gaddafi's stockpiles, which arguably are beginning to enter the sub-region in a big way. A great deal of concern. As Secretary Clinton noted, we are willing to provide financial resources. We work very closely with the countries of the Sahelian region. As you mentioned, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, first and foremost in their fight against AQIM, the rebel group, the terrorist group.
That's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in the Northern Africa branch.
That's correct. That's correct. Obviously, we're concerned if these weapons flow towards AQIM and to other groups. I think it's fair to say that it's one of our greatest concerns in the northern part, in the Sahelian region. But we can't forget that there are a number of refugees who are flowing out of Libya as well. For instance,
these were people who worked in Libya under Gaddafi, had jobs there.
That's correct. And remember that a number of these folks were also in Gaddafi's military. They're armed, well-equipped, and have returned to countries like Niger and to northern Mali. For Niger to absorb, say, more than 100,000 refugees, and it's already a desperately poor country. For them to be able to absorb 100,000 people really, really stretches the social fabric of the country.
I've heard estimates ranging upwards of 20,000 shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, which are now essentially on the loose.
We call them man-pads. And yes, obviously sophisticated weaponry such as man-pads and other types of equipment are clearly pose a destabilizing balance to the security and the stability in the region.
So what specifically is the U.S. doing? You say that, you're concerned about it. Hillary Clinton's spoken about it. I've heard that there's millions of dollars in aid going to these countries. How's it being used? What?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we're working first and foremost together with these countries to patrol their borders, to make sure that these weapons don't enter into the hands of people like terrorists who are operating in the northern parts of these countries.
I'm going to get to the more positive aspects in a moment, notably the democracy. No, we know it's not all negative, but I do need to remain. Sure. I want to ask you about the terrorist threat, because it's a major issue right now. And moving away from northern Africa, in the so-called Horn of Africa region, Somalia, there was a recent report in the Washington Post that the U.S. is actually building bases for drones in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, and in the Seychelles. First of all, can you sort of confirm those reports? And if so, what's the aim of this policy?
No, I can't confirm those reports. I mean, what we've seen most recently is that the Shabab forces are on retreat. They've been pushed out by the Amazon forces. What I can tell you,
Shabab in Somalia. This is a terrorist group.
Is also affiliated with with the Al Qaeda network worldwide. What we have been doing, the U.S. has been doing, is providing political capacity building, material support to the TFG, the transitional federal government in Somalia. But we've also been providing military equipment and training, military equipment in the most basic forms, uniforms, boots, communications equipment, to the Amazon forces. That is the AU stabilization mission.
The African Union mission.
Right.
Okay.
And that is up and running inside of Mogadishu. You have the Burundians, you have the Ugandans, very shortly, conceivably, you'll have the Sierra Leoneans who've also said that they would contribute to the effort.
But no drone. But as far as drones are concerned, I'm pushing the point because it's
I
significant for a lot.
No,
because it is a significant issue for a lot of people. The issue of drone attacks and whether it could create even a backlash, the perception.
Right. Well, to be perfectly honest with you, the State Department is focusing. What we see as so important is this AMISOM effort to provide support and to provide security and stability within Mogadishu. There's been a lot of intense fighting, and that's a concern in itself. But these forces are trying to play the best role possible, and they represent the good part of Africa, where Africa is willing to stand up for a neighbor and to provide security. Now,
the U.S. is it has troops right now deployed on the ground, I believe, trying to track down or help to track down the Lord's Resistance Army, the rebels in Uganda.
Sure.
I know it's not that many soldiers, it's 100, and the U.S. has been clear that they're not actually combating the rebels themselves.
They're not combat troops, no.
But it's still, it bears pointing out that it's the biggest U.S. deployment in Africa since Somalia, the fiasco in Somalia in '93.
Well, yes, I understand why you're calling it fiasco. I like to think of it, again, we were trying to do good, and unfortunately the groups there, again, remain in chaos.
Let me talk about some positive things right now.
Okay.
The U.S. is trying to do right now. We recently saw a resolution to the standoff in Ivory Coast with Alassane Ouattara finally being able to assume the presidency after a long and bloody standoff with his predecessor, Laurent Gbagbo. U.S. wants to now get in on the ground there, I assume.
You're
see
talking
more
about
companies
as far
there.
as business? Yeah.
Business there. How are these efforts going? I mean, in sort of trying to get there, trying to ensure that the U.S. has a presence there.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, we've had a number of companies that have been operating in Cote d'Ivoire for a long time. I talk about Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, the Mars Company. These are all obviously focused on the cocoa sector. But no, it's a very good point. We also have financial.
Because France also wants to step up its.
Very much so, and I think that's really a very good point that you're making. Is that it's competition. We don't mind American companies so long as there's a level playing field. We don't mind competition. We believe that the products that we provide are just as good, in fact, better than most of our competitors, so long as the playing field is level. We do have a number of companies working in the cocoa sector. What we're going to begin to see more and more is that Cote d'Ivoire is also an oil-rich country.
It hasn't developed those resources enough.
Well, it has, but it's relied on Russian and Canadian, and I think more and more, certainly is the Jubilee field, which is largely in the Ghanaian waters, in fact crosses the border into Ivorian waters. I think we're going to see the oil sector begin to increase. American companies are already involved. In Ghana, Cosmos is exploiting the Jubilee field. Chevron has recently signed a long-term agreement with the government of Liberia. We also have a small company, Hyperdynamics, which is working with the Guinean government. Again, an American firm.
So American firms very much active in Ivory Coast and beyond.
Yeah.
We speak very much about China's ambitions on the African continent as well. And is there concern or a fear that in some respects America may be leaving an open field, so to speak, to Chinese interests? Because the Chinese are very much in there for business and business.
Yeah.
Business is business.
Business is business. And again, if it's a level playing field, we have no problem competing with the Russians, competing with the French, competing with the Chinese even. I think, though, when we bring up China, there are concerns that somehow the Africans are being duped. And I really want to put that to rest. Listen, the Africans are very shrewd, and the African countries are not having the wool pulled over their eyes by the Chinese. Look at Zambia, the recent election of Michael Sata, who for a long time has criticized the Chinese for poor labor practices and also trying to push their own surplus population into China to take on some of these jobs. Time and time again, country after country, I talk with the Africans. The Africans aren't being duped. They absolutely insist that their day laborers are employed on these projects. Sure, the Chinese will bring in supervisors and engineers. I don't think that anyone objects to that. But the idea that somehow China is taking advantage of the Africans, I just
They won't let themselves be taken advantage of, is essentially what you're saying.
Thank you. Essentially what I'm saying is the Africans are pretty shrewd and they're not being taken advantage of.
William Fitzgerald, in the very little time we have left,
Understood.
There are big democratic elections coming up in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were set for November 28th, I believe is the date. Now we're hearing perhaps it might be postponed. Do you see these elections as being on track? What's the biggest obstacle right now?
The biggest obstacle is obviously logistics. DRC is an enormous country. To give it a semblance of size for the American viewers and for the African viewers, you know, it's the size of basically the United States east of the Mississippi River. I think it would be very difficult for a state in the United States to be able to put elections together and the logistics and the ballots and the boxes in a size of territory that is so vast.
So we may just see a slight delay, is what you're saying.
I don't know if there's going to be a delay. I certainly hope there's not going to be a delay.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it
That's
there. We have
bad.
other elections I know coming up, and we have so much really influx right now in Africa,
Right.
and we could speak all day about it.
Right.
But you have a very complex plate of issues, and I thank you for discussing just a few of them with me today here on France 24. We've been listening to William Fitzgerald, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, on the interview at France 24.